Welcome back to the second one-half-hour debate between Senate District 18 candidates for the State Senate. This debate is between, obviously, Jessica King and Rick Gudex. Once again, joining me as co-moderator is Tony Palmeri, Professor of Communication from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, and he will offer the next question.
Thank you, Ben. Whichever of you gets selected will be involved in the next biennial budget negotiations, and as you both know, to balance a budget, you can either raise taxes, you can make cuts, or you can have some combination of them. Rick, if you get elected, what's your approach to the budget? Are you more like Governor Walker? It's got to be all cuts, no tax increases at all?
I think that, well, of course, I'm not going to support tax increases. I think one of the main focuses of the next budget needs to be education. We talked about it in the last segment. We talked about education. There is a skills gap coming, and we do need to figure out what we're going to do to cover that skills gap. I believe that we need to work with our corporate entities to make sure that they're feeding the correct information to the school districts and letting them know exactly what their needs are moving forward, and critique those curriculums to meet what the corporate entities need. And I think in order to do that, we need to head down a path of more local control than government control. But yes, I do believe that education needs to be a first and foremost, thing to look at going into the next budget session.
And this can be done without any additional,
I believe it can. I believe it can. I believe that we can find ways to make education a priority. I also think that we can take a look at opportunities to find where we can start giving money back to the people. I think that the first step was freezing taxes and making actually, my taxes went down in the city of Fond du Lac. I think that what we need to do is start finding a way to continue that trend and give people an honest sense of what's actually happening out there. I think that, Act 10 was a stepping stone for great things, and I think that we need to build on those. So I'm excited to potentially be a part of setting the next budget.
All right, Jessica, your approach to the budget.
Well, I think you have to have a balanced approach. You have to decide what things can you cut, what things can you take, make an initial investment now to experience return over years. And the biggest thing we need to do right now is broaden the economy, expand it. And a lot of that has to do with getting people living wage jobs. And the best way to do that is making sure that they have a credential, because right now we have a situation where we have job vacancies and we don't, the folks who are underemployed or dislocated, they don't have the credential to fill the vacancy. And that's really what the problem is here. And that's projected to grow in the next 10 years. So we have to focus on that. We also have to get back to focusing on supporting local Wisconsin entrepreneurs rather than making this effort to try to create a mythical environment. We have to get back to basics, and a lot of that can happen with support of venture capital proposal. And really making sure that we're looking at innovative technologies and helping the technology industry grow. And then I think we have to look at other proposals like focus on energy. The Republican legislature in the last budget cut the funding to focus on energy. From 2001 to 2009, Focus on Energy created 24,000 jobs, and that was verified by an independent source. For every dollar that was spent on Focus on Energy, businesses saved $2.50. And it also was savings that the average homeowner received too, anybody who participated in the program. And the Republican legislature cut it. They cut the funding. In 2010, the legislature said we were going to fully fund this and it was going to create another 7,000 to 9,000 jobs. And that's something that I want to go to bat for in the legislature. And I don't understand why the Republican majority didn't support it, because Wisconsin as a state every year spends $12 billion on energy that we pay out of state. And so we need to keep that money here and build our local economy.
Ben?
Well, with the $3.6 billion deficit, how would the Republicans have funded that? The continuation of the
It's about
focus?
it's about choices and priorities.
But do you have an example of what you would have cut to fund that? Because if you're starting the budget cycle in a $3.6 billion hole, what would you remove, or what would you cut to continue to fund that focus on energy?
Well, Ben, I think we need to remember that every budget cycle passes a balanced budget. Okay, I mean you know that, right? That every budget is balanced when it's passed. So it's just an issue of looking at priorities versus give and
understand,
take.
But do you have an example of what you would have cut? I mean, what would you have support for a cut to restore that continuation of the funding? As someone who
Again, I think it's looking at these proposals where we gave large corporations tax credits and there was no requirement that they create jobs. So I think it's saying instead of giving tax giveaways to large corporations, we would have saved that revenue and invested it into something that we knew for certain would have created 9,000 jobs, and that would have been the trade-off. There was 100 businesses from around the state that supported it, and we didn't do it.
So speaking of tax credits, I know you both are very familiar with Fond du Lac, and obviously there's a few years ago Fond du Lac Mercury Marine was looking at moving to Stillwater, Oklahoma, and now we all know the story. Stillwater has moved to Fond du Lac, and there's a major expansion, economic development, and there was what some would argue was tax giveaways, tax credits in order to get those jobs. Do you support those types of tax credits?
Well, certainly. I mean, I don't know if you know this, Ben, but my grandfather and my uncle worked with Carl Kiekever in the CCC camps. I mean, my grandfather and my uncle were two of the first employees at Merc Marine. My grandfather was a plant manager. My uncle was that company means a lot to Fond du Lac. But you have to do analysis on each proposal. And the Merc Marine proposal had benchmarks in it for them to be eligible for tax credits based on job creation. Now, there are other policies in the last budget that did not have such strict requirements. And those are the ones we really need to give scrutiny to and say we can't give tax credits for the sake of giving a tax credit. They need to be accountable.
Okay.
I was on the city council and took that vote to extend what the city of Fond du Lac gave towards the Merc Marine endeavor to keep Merc Marine in Fond du Lac. So I'm proud of the fact that we were able to do that in Fond du Lac, and I certainly support endeavors like that moving forward. I think that there all too often are there's too many outs for business now. Business can move out of state, businesses can move out of country, and I think we need to do everything we can to protect those businesses and to make them grow. And I think it's responsible for not only at the local level but at the state level to look at things like that when those situations arise. And to be honest with you, the city of Fond du Lac is well known for being a city who's very friendly to business. And it shows. We're expanding. We've got numerous businesses expanding in Fond du Lac. I'll give you an example, Wells Vehicle Electronics. Jessica King was at the groundbreaking. Steve Jenkins from the Fond du Lac County Economic Development Corporation cited the fact that there's going to be 73 jobs created over 3 years at that location because of the expansion. But it's not only 73 jobs. What happens is those 73 jobs trickle down into affecting 500 jobs. So if you took that at a larger scale, like the mining bill, and if you would have passed the mining bill, Senator King, you would have been in a situation where those potentially 500 jobs in the immediate mine could have trickled down into thousands and thousands of jobs here within the state of Wisconsin. You know, those are the types of things we can't fall asleep at the wheel on. We need to make sure that we're taking the opportunity to invest in Wisconsin and help the citizens grow themselves through job opportunities and help their families.
Let's talk about the mining bill, Rick. There were lots of people, not just Democrats. I mean, Senator Schultz, I believe, a Republican, was saying that the notice requirements were being shortened in a way that was not going to be helpful to the Wisconsin environment. I mean, do you believe that we should allow a company to set up a mine with minimal environmental regulations? I mean, what is your view on?
I think the legislation that was brought forward was responsible. The Department of Natural Resources okayed that legislation and said they were comfortable with the fact that those requirements met what they needed to get their job done. And that's the bottom line. I mean, we shouldn't tie up business and hold them hostage when they need to make decisions. They've got capital invested. They need to get their projects moving. And we can't sit there and put our foot on the brake and hold up the process, you know, for an unneeded reason. This type of mining is magnetic mining. This is not chemical mining. This type of mining is where you're crushing rock, you're separating the ore from the rock, and you have a wash cycle where you're washing the product before it goes into a rail car. Very simple process. It's not detrimental to the environment as would a chemical extraction be. So it's responsible. The people up there,
Sure.
the people up there wanted this piece of legislation. There's people up there who are living on $35,000 on a family income, and those people need help. And the Democrats, along with Schultz, said no, we're not going to allow this legislation. We're going to hold it up. And it just happened to be at a time where there was a recalling process. So, you know, put things together however you'd like, but, you know, it was a no vote. It was an irresponsible vote, and Senator King fell asleep.
All right, Jessica, you were obviously one of the Democrats who voted against it. Defend your vote against that mine.
Well, you know what? This is funny to me because, we talk about including the stakeholders and getting in touch with what our constituents think. I did a survey, a constituent survey in the spring before that vote was taken, and only 28% of the constituents in this district approved of the assembly version. It was a 183-page bill that VAT went too far, it was too extreme, and the constituents here, based on my survey, said they didn't support that version. Rather, they supported the version that I worked on with Senator Schultz. There was a bipartisan version of the bill, and that version of the bill was 8 pages long, and it strictly dealt with the permitting process because that's what the company publicly stated it needed to have reformed. It didn't put, in 186 pages, you can hide a lot of little details that people aren't aware of. It took away local control. I've heard my opponent talk a lot about respecting local control, and the assembly version took that away from local communities. It also was not responsible to the taxpayers up there because it would devastate the local town roads without providing funding for them to reconstruct it.
Well,
Now,
he says the people up there want jobs. There is a lot of poverty in that region of the state.
well, people say they want jobs, but not at the expense of their environment and at the local taxpayer. I mean, that would have devastated their road construction, and there was no money allocated to make sure that the roads would be rebuilt. I mean, very simple things like that. But let's talk about this. I was willing to say, let's keep the communication open. When we took the majority, I was the senator that called for the continued discussions over the mining legislation to make sure all stakeholders were there, because when the assembly version that my opponent supports was crafted, it wasn't open to the public. And the community members weren't allowed to be there, conservation groups weren't allowed to be there, the Native Americans, tribes people that also live up north were not allowed to be there. So it wasn't an open process. So I'm support responsible mining. I co-sponsored a bill. We didn't get to vote on it, and we'll continue to talk about it, but we needs to be
All right,
responsible.
Let's let Rick get the last word on this.
Sure,
And-
sure.
And what we're missing here is that, the piece of legislation he's talking about, that was a piece of legislation that had 20 amendments introduced, 20 amendments accepted by the Republican Party. So yes, I mean, there was a lot of give and take in this legislation, and it ultimately didn't pass. It's also funny to hear her say that people really didn't want this at the expense of the environment. I can't even tell you how many people from up in that area have called me personally, called my campaign down here, hoping that I get in, telling me that, hey, Rick, keep going, we need you, we need mining up here. Our families we can't get married because I don't have a job. People up there are working 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet. They need this mining bill. They need this influx of income and job opportunity and growth up there. And you know what? I support it. I support the way the bill stands. And people understand that if I don't get in, the mining legislation will not happen. And the mining legislation she proposed with Schultz is mining legislation that would have handcuffed the business, and it would have made it nearly impossible for them to move forward. Things would have been tied up in courts for years before a hole would have been dug.
Okay, so can we move on?
Yeah, let's move
All
on.
right, well, and if we could, because I want to get to several, we're at the halfway point, I have several other questions, so I'm going to ask if you can keep your answer to about a minute or less. I'm not going to hold you to it, but Tony will. So the question I have is, speaking of robust legislation that's reams of paper, the Taxpayer Affordable Act, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, where do you stand? Where should the state stand? And if you don't support it, why not? And whose turn is it, Tony? Jessica King.
Sure. I'll tell you what, no legislation is perfect. It's federal legislation. There's definitely good pieces to it. It makes sure that children young adults under the age of 26 are able to stay on their parents' insurance coverage. It makes sure that people can get insurance despite having pre-existing conditions. So a lot of good pieces to that. But the thing we have to focus on now is that we need to establish our healthcare exchange system and how we're going to make Wisconsin's healthcare exchange function so that consumers actually have an understanding of how they compare policies and what is covered, what's the price, what's the premium that's going to be required. It's like creating when people buy plane tickets, there's Orbitz, there's Expedia. People can compare what they're getting. And that's actually what the healthcare exchange is. It's going to be a database that allows consumers to pick their policies based on criteria that insurance companies are going to have
And
to
the governor
match.
said he's not going to create those exchanges, and you think he's wrong.
Exactly,
All right.
because I don't think we
Okay.
should let the
Right.
federal
And that was
government do
exactly
that.
a minute.
Okay.
Right.
So-
And you believe, Rick, that the governor is correct in not wanting to
Well,
enforce
I'll
this part
I'll
of
answer the
Obamacare?
question. You
Go
don't have to
ahead.
answer it for me. But I don't
Right.
su- I don't
Just
su-
ask it.
I don't support the Affordable Care Act. I mean, obviously, there's nothing affordable about this act. There are some pieces of that legislation that are positive. You know, there's no doubt about it. But for the most part, this is not a sustainable act. Should the state get involved and set up their own exchanges? Absolutely. If we're forced to do so, we should set it up so that this act is set up for people in Wisconsin, not for the people of the whole United States. You know, the Affordable Health Care Act, I prefer to have the decision on my healthcare decisions be made with me and my doctor. I don't want any interference with any government entity, any government board saying that you can or you can't have this procedure or you have to wait for this procedure. I mean, look at how Canada is run right now. I mean, I don't want that to happen here. I don't want to be in a situation where my taxes are going to have to go up to support this thing. You know, the costs keep going up, the projections keep going up, and I just think it's a bad piece of legislation.
And that was about exactly a minute also. I actually wanted to ask a series of yes/nos, and I would ask if you want to expand on your yes/no at conclusion of this bullet points. Take some notes, and maybe I'll give you a minute to clarify. But I have a series of questions in terms of do you support this? And I'd like to start with Rick and go right down the line. Excuse me, I'll go with Rick and I'll alternate. Do you support gay marriage?
No.
Jessica?
Yes.
Okay. Do you support, well, Obamacare?
No.
Yes.
Okay. Conceal and carry law?
Yes, I have concealed carry.
Yes.
Okay. Do you support the death penalty?
Undecided.
No.
No. Do you support, well, my 11-year-old wanted me to ask this. Do you support the youth hunt where 10 and 11-year-olds can hunt in the
Yes.
mentorship program?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay. Do you feel that the government should pay for abortions?
No.
Low income individuals get paid?
I don't believe the government does that now.
Okay. Do you think we have too many laws in the state of Wisconsin?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. So, and I guess if you want 30 seconds, do you want to expand on any of those answers?
No.
Okay,
I
clarify
think
any points?
I think I clarified. You know, my answers are pretty to the
Okay.
point.
Well, I think it's important. You know, one of the things that Rick and I do agree on is sportsmen's rights. I've been very much willing to talk to my constituents here about, you know, the importance of maintaining our hunting heritage. And I think, you know, making sure we have a good sturgeon habitat, making sure that we maintain a strong hunting heritage is very important. And I think people are surprised to know that the NRA gave me a B rating.
Okay, thanks. And that was exactly
got an
30
A
seconds.
rating.
Okay.
All right. Can I move on to another?
Yeah, and I actually want to thank our viewers. You know, I reached out to some individuals and asked for questions, and they're to both of you, and I think, you know, yes or no, you both obviously answered them, and thank you.
All right. Rick, the governor and the Republican majority passed what was probably the most restrictive voter ID law in the nation, and it's being tied up in the courts, of course. Do you support that voter ID law that was
Yes, I
passed?
do. Yeah.
Why?
Well, I'll tell you why. You know, it's no different than being responsible in buying alcohol or any other thing that we have to have an ID for nowadays. There should be no reason why you don't carry or don't have to have an ID to vote. You need to have an ID to buy alcohol. You need to have an ID to get into the Democratic National Convention. But we don't need an ID to do the single most important fundamental thing in the United States, and that's to vote. You know, there are ways that everybody is able to get an ID. Now, some people would argue that, you know, I don't have a birth certificate. I'm 85 years old, and I can't get a ID. You know, we can make exceptions for things like that, but you're talking less than 1% of the population, by far, not being able to get an ID. There's no reason we shouldn't have ID. People in Iraq taking their first vote, dip their finger in purple ink. They get it. Why don't we get it here in the United States? I don't understand why there's so much animosity towards having an ID to vote and to prove who you are when you select, you know, the person you're voting for. I just don't get the concept. So for me, it's a simple thing. You know, have an ID, have a vote, move forward.
Jessica, what's your view?
I personally think we should go back to the purple ink method. I think that would eliminate fraud, and we'd all know who voted and who didn't vote. I think that's a good idea, Rick.
Something better than today.
Well, I mean, I think what we have to realize is, this last election, I know I went out and did a lot of door knocking, and there were a lot of elderly folks who did not have an ID. They didn't have a driver's license. They didn't have an ID. They no longer drive. They can't get to the DMV. And I think it's really a case where there's about 300,000 elderly people that are being disenfranchised by this ID requirement. And I don't understand why we would create these barriers, especially up north, because I think, we assume because Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, we have DMVs in our communities and they're open, but they're not necessarily accessible by bus. And when you go to the northern counties, they don't have DMVs in their local community. They can't really get there. The other thing about the voter ID law that people don't realize is it took away, there's no longer a requirement to have high school registration deputies. So for rural kids in rural high schools, the township clerk is only open from 8 to 4 or has those daytime hours. The kids are in school. So they won't be able to register unless they go on the same day. And I don't understand why we're making this difficult. We should be encouraging young people to exercise their right to vote.
Do you want to continue on this issue, or?
Well,
Just one thing, I'll only take a couple seconds. I mean, if you really want to vote, you'll find a way to get to the DMV. If you really want to vote, you'll find a way to get to the county clerk. It's as easy as that. I mean, we don't vote every day. There's months and months and months between cycles. Yeah, well,
I think lately it's every 8 weeks, Rick. I don't know.
So, I mean, there's opportunity to get to the DMV, and there's opportunity to get there. So I don't think we should disenfranchise.
I'd like to ask you both, if you were a state senator at the time, Jessica King, Democrat, Rick is run as a Republican. If you were a state senator at the time, would you have joined the other Democrats and fled to Illinois?
If I would have been a state senator at that time, the numbers would have been different, and we wouldn't even gotten into that space. We wouldn't have even had to make that decision.
Well, let's say it was exactly the same.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what I would have done. I think that's a situation you look at the time you're in that seat.
Do you agree with their action to flee the state?
I think everybody has to stand on their own judgment. I'm not going to condone anybody else's activity. Us as elected officials, we have to stand by what we do at the time we do it, and I'm not going to judge.
And I assume that I know your answer, but if you want to just take 10 seconds.
Would I ever run out of the state?
Yeah.
No, you stand and you do your job.
Okay.
And to be quite honest about it, if you leave the state, you should be fired. Plain and simple. It happens in business, it should happen in this situation.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left. I'd like to probe the concept of right to work.
Go ahead. Why don't you introduce
Well,
that?
just to explain to our viewers, the concept of right to work is related to whether or not an employee must join a union. It originated in 1947 in the Taft-Hartley Act. And there's different types of concept right to work: closed shops, open shops, agency shops. Should Wisconsin be a right to work state, or should we support something else? What's your opinion on forced union joining? So I'd like to ask Rick, what's your concept on?
I stated before, I'm willing to look at any piece of legislation that would come before me. To say
and by the way, I'm going to try to hold you guys to about a minute on this.
To say if I would vote for it or not at this point, I can't say because I don't know how the legislation would vote or how the legislation would look. But I can tell you that even if I did support it, I don't think it would really pass. I think there's enough split between the parties that this thing really wouldn't move forward. So at this point, I would have to say that I have to look at the legislation and make a decision based on how it's written.
Okay, Jessica?
I don't support right-to-work legislation. We are at a point where we really need to appreciate that states that do have right-to-work legislation have lower median incomes, they have higher youth mortality, they have less achievement and support of their educational structures. And so, no, I don't support it.
Okay.
Okay. I want to ask a question about the First Amendment. I mean, as you know, we've had a lot of protests at the Capitol, and it looks like in Madison, I guess it's the sheriff's office down there is putting some restrictions on protest. Capitol Police, where you now have to get a permit, I believe, in order to be able to protest in the Capitol. Do you believe, Rick, that the First Amendment requires a permit to protest in the Capitol?
My opinion is this. I mean, there's become permanent protesters. And I think that, there needs to start being some civility down there. I mean, we've spent millions and millions of dollars cleaning up the Capitol, given all of the protesting that's gone on down there. Should there be a semblance of order? Yeah. Should we protect our First Amendment rights to free assembly and free speech? I believe we should, but I think there needs to be some normalcy in how that approach is done. So something had to be done. The people that are obviously doing the protesting are forcing this issue based on their behavior. So it's kind of a toss-up for me.
Jessica?
I think it shouldn't be illegal for somebody to hold a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. I think our Capitol should be open and accessible to the people. It is their Capitol. They are taxpayers. I find it, interesting that we restrict people's ability for speech at a time when we've now allowed weapons in the Capitol. I support allowing weapons in the Capitol, but I also support people having their 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper in the Capitol and their signs. And I think, it's really extreme the way we've cut down on people's speech. Mm-hmm. And, I can say, Rick was there protesting me about the Assembly version of the mining bill. And as an elected official...
I wasn't there, though.
You were... Well, okay, let me rephrase.
I was never at the Capitol.
Well, let me rephrase. We were in Fond du Lac at a bus stop, and Rick was involved in a protest of me because of my stance on the mining bill.
I need to clarify that when she's done.
And I think that's okay. I think it's okay for him to be at a protest of me and protest something where we don't agree. And I think, that should be allowed.
I actually was there as City Council President. I actually welcomed Senator King to Fond du Lac, and the protesters came up behind at that point. I did step off to the side, and I did not participate in the protest. So I didn't do that. I stood on the side. I did at one point say that I would have supported the mining bill because they were really hammering you on the mining bill, but I did not have signs. I was not picketing. I was off on the side. So
okay, my impression when somebody directly says they'll support the Assembly version of the mining bill, that they were standing there participating. But thank you for the clarification, because I didn't take it that way.
Yeah, we have about a minute and a half, so I guess if we keep our questions or our answers to about 20 seconds, and this is what I'll take for this. Speaking of protest, did either of you, or did you go down to Madison and protest and join?
I did not.
Okay. I assume that,
Nope, I was
okay.
not down there.
And we clarified, you did not protest her, and you didn't protest in Madison, so we got that clarified. So I guess if you want to take 15 seconds, let our viewers know how they can contact you if they'd like to get more information.
Yeah, I just want to close by saying that, back in the debate back in '08 when Jessica debated Randy Hopper, she made a statement, I wrote it down here because I watched it. She said that at the end of the day, it's all about your vote. And you're absolutely correct, Senator. It's about your vote. It's about your mining vote and about your Welfare Reform Act vote. So, if you want to move forward, please vote for Rick Gudex. www.rickgudexforsenate.com. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Just very quick.
If you want moderate government, you vote for Jessica King. I have an 80% voting record with Republicans. I work across the aisle, and I do the due diligence in my work. And I would appreciate your vote on November 6th.
All right. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks our viewers for tuning in. November 6th is the vote. Make sure you get out and vote and let your voice be heard. Thank you.